Now I'm on?
Yep.
Thank you. Let me repeat myself. Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see you, and I appreciate you being here. We have a music festival going on in Salem tonight, and there's lots of little bands out on the streets, and so we'll have some interference with it. So I just want to tell you what it is, and we'll work with it. Praise the Lord. And I said before the camera came on that tonight we're going to fight a war, and then try to examine what that war was about and when it happened. And so we're going to turn to chapter 38 in Ezekiel. And the first thing we're going to do is line up the sides of this warfare. Now remember, we ended the class last week with chapter 37, verse 27, where God says, "My dwelling place will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord that makes Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever." And so what is starting to happen now are the wars at the end of time. And I would like to direct you to page 28 in your curriculum. And I'm going to read this section in chapter 38, and then we'll examine what this is all about. Okay, chapter 38 in Ezekiel. The word of the Lord came to me, "Son of man, set your face against Gog and the land of Gog, which is Magog. And he is the chief prince also of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws and bring you out of your whole army and your horses and your horsemen and the great horde that is with you, and small shields that are Okay, I think we're back on. And I'm sorry. Do you have any idea how long I was off?
No.
Okay. Well, I guess I can just keep going. This war is
Test, test.
Then Northern Africa and Eastern Africa. So these are all places geographically that are coming against Israel. Well, now I'm going to this. And so these are the enemies of Israel at the end of time. And so basically, you come down to Eastern Europe, Russia, Iran, and Northern and Eastern Africa. So it's the Middle East, edges of Africa, Eastern Europe, and Russia that come against Israel at the end of time, which, if you look at the situations in the world today, and you just simply trace discrimination against Christians and Jews, you can see that in these areas there is a rising amount of discrimination against our faith. And so evidently, as we approach more and more and more the end of time, we become more and more set in these nations. So what I want to do is, if I look at page 28 in your curriculum, halfway down this page, I have Gog's allies, and I have the ancient name, and then beside it I have the modern day area. And so you can see again these areas that are listed here and where they are associated. And down at the bottom I have a quote from Daniel. There we go. I have this quote in Daniel 7, verses 19, where Daniel is seeing a prophecy of the Antichrist, and this is put together in prophetic concepts, but we can translate them. And so it says in Daniel 7, verse 19, and this is Daniel speaking, "Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast. The fourth beast is the most powerful beast that comes out of this crown. And who is the fourth beast? From all the others, and he was more terrifying, with its iron teeth. Iron in the book of Daniel is always prophesied as Rome. And so Daniel comes to the conclusion that the Antichrist comes out of the ancient Roman boundaries of Europe. So if you're aware at all of how the Roman Empire controlled Europe, you have the boundaries of the Antichrist territory. And also, this is an interesting and sad fact that the present-day European Union is basically the same boundaries as the ancient Roman Empire. And so you have these nations that are coming against Israel. And again, you look at the sizes here from a natural point of view, and it is incredible. You've got this little tiny nation of Israel that has a population like maybe 9 million, and it is surrounded by nations of over 300 million in all directions. And yet this is a major issue in the world, and what it's driven by is the spirit of the Antichrist. And what you're going to see here is all the way through history of ancient Israel, God always went in front of the Israeli army, the army of the Israelites. God always went in front of them and in essence fought their battles for them. And the Israelites knew this. And it's a very interesting fact that at the front rank of the Israelite army that marched into battle to confront an enemy were trumpeters. They weren't the biggest and best warriors with swords and shields and spears and everything else. It were the trumpeters blowing their trumpets, because they were blowing their trumpets because they believed with their whole heart that that's where God was leading the army into warfare. And so you have this situation where this tiny little nation is under attack by huge, huge numbers. Now, if we want to engage this image in modern day, and you have an enormous army swarming down into an area against a little tiny bitty country that stands alone, you say this isn't a fight, it's a massacre. But God doesn't see it that way. God does the same thing here that he has always done. He comes to defend his people. God defends us every day, and he defends Israel. And so what is taking place here is not so much of a natural battle between a huge, vast army and a small nation. No, what is happening here is a war between these masses of this army and God. And God uses the very elements of his natural creation against this natural huge army. So he fights this army on its own terms. And instead of Israel being defeated, this army is driven off the fields through natural disasters, huge earthquakes, which you're going to understand. This is the first time Jesus prophesied that at the end of times there would be huge earthquakes. And it's an interesting fact. The earth has hundreds and hundreds of earthquakes every day. I mean, like 500, 700, 1,000 earthquakes in one day on planet Earth. But they're all localized. They're all in some city in Bangladesh or India or China or Turkey or someplace, but they're all localized. These earthquakes from God will not be local. They will be worldwide. And Jesus tells his disciples, these earthquakes are going to be something that you have never seen before, nor will you ever see again. And so God fights the battle for Israel, just like he did in all the times of Jehoshaphat and David and Hezekiah and Josiah, all of these huge armies that came against Israel, they were always defeated. And here is a perfect example of it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read. Now, again, I can tell you, look at this list, and you'll notice I didn't finish Daniel's prophecy. After Daniel sees the fourth beast with its iron teeth, which symbolizes Europe, he also sees that the beast has bronze claws, and bronze is the symbol of Greece, Eastern Europe. And you can see a list of these ancient names and the present day geographics of these nations. So I'm going to again start. We were down in the point of the last statement in verse 6 of chapter 38, which says that that all of these armies will come from the far north with all its troops, the many nations that are with Gog. Now, the point here that's interesting is that all these nations are collapsing on Israel. And again, in natural terms, you would think Israel does not have a single chance in a trillion. But God will fight this battle for them, and it will fight this battle in terms of the elements that God himself had created. So God is like throwing his creation into the face of all these armies, and that's what happens here. So I want to go to chapter 38, and I'd like to go to verse 15. Now, the point being is that all the way through the Bible, there are certain terms that always symbolize a stronghold of the enemy. Always. A stronghold of the enemy. And these terms are, and you're going to see it over and over again, these terms are the north. The north is always a place of evil and godless people who come and attack Israel. The north. You can see the north you're going to see the north in Ezekiel 38:15, and it's repeated a number of times in Ezekiel. You can also find the north as a place of the enemy in Zechariah 6, verse 8. Zechariah chapter 6, verse 8. But here in verse 15, I just will mention right now, the other place of evil, the stronghold of evil, is on the other side of the Euphrates River. And in Genesis, God outlines the world that God has given, the promised land that God is giving Abraham, and one of the boundaries in which that promised land is the Euphrates River. On the other side of the Euphrates River is evil. On the foresight of the west side of the Euphrates River, the righteous live. And you'll also see that God, when he lists out the boundaries of Israel in Deuteronomy to Moses, says the same thing. The boundary line between the Israelites, the righteous, and the world, the unrighteous, is the Euphrates River. And in Revelation, there is a story about evil coming across, and of course, what is it coming across? It's coming across the Euphrates River to attack the righteous and move on to Israel. And so these terms are very clear and mentioned over and over in the Bible, that the evil is north and the evil is the other side of the Euphrates River. And so I want you to know that, so that when you hear about these images like this, you'll know what they're talking about. So let's go to verse 15 in chapter 38, and I'm going to read you some of this scripture which describes what I've been telling you about how God fights against these vast armies. You think a vast army cannot be stopped. A vast army can't lose because they just will overwhelm any enemy. But God says, no, you're not going to overwhelm me. And so God brings a supernatural element into the natural to fight these armies. And these armies basically don't have a chance. They don't have a chance against God, and God is going to throw his creation right into their faces. And so in verse 15 it says, you, and this is talking about Gog. God is talking to Gog. Gog is G-O-G, and Magog is his country, which is, but you can see by the map that I drew, is Russia. The ancient name of Russia is Magog. And so, and of course, Russia is north. So here we go. It says here, you will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, great hordes and mighty armies. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In days to come, O Gog, I will bring you against my land so that the nations of the world may know that when I show myself holy through you, through actions against you, before their eyes. First of all, it's a little bit of an interesting point. When God speaks prophecy, he speaks prophecy to the universal humanity that we're part of. We live at a certain place in a certain time and see things a certain way. So God speaks his prophecies in ways that we can understand it. But he also has to speak his prophecies to all other nations, all other people, all of the different times. So prophecy seems a little bit difficult because it shows you an answer to God's plan in infinite numbers of languages and themes and people, so that an ancient Egyptian who has come to God can understand the prophecies of God just like you can understand the prophecies of God. And one of the things is that when you go back into warfare, God uses terms that the ancient people will understand. They know what a horse is, and they know what a horse does in battle. They would have no idea what a tank is, or what a tank or a jet plane or a missile would do in battle. So you see, when the descriptions are given to what the armies are, they are given in ancient terms so that people living at that time can understand it, and that people who are living later can look back on their history and accept what God is saying. So a horse to them is a tank to us. So that's why you have these things written in this way. I would like to have you pick it up in verse 18 now of chapter 38. And this is what will happen on that day. So God is now going to explain to you what he's going to do. And remember what I told you, the earth was created by God. The earth listens to the voice of God. And so what is happening here is this battle on very different terms. The warfare of the enemy is in physical might. The warfare of God is in spiritual justice. Remember, thank you, Nelda. Remember what it says in Zechariah, when God tells Zechariah that when things happen, they don't happen by might. See, that's what Gog was depending upon. And they don't happen by power, which is Gog's weapon. No, it happens by the Spirit of God. So we would look at its battle and say, poor Israel, and I guess poor us, don't stand a chance. But God's just shaking his head and smiling and say, not to worry. And so let's go back to verse 18. And it says, when God attacks the land of Israel, when Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there will be great earthquakes. All right? And this earthquake is going to be described a little farther, and it's the same way Jesus described the earthquake 600 years later. And it says that there will be great earthquake in the land of Israel. the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the beasts of the fields, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people, listen, all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. And the mountains will be overturned, and the cliffs will crumble, and every wall will fall to the ground. And I will summon, this is verse 21, I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Now this is a sword of God. This is not a sword of man. And every man's sword will be against his brother, and I will execute judgment upon him with the plagues, and the bloodshed will be poured down in torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and all his troops and all of the many nations that are with him. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. And so when God brings what he calls his mighty sword against you on my holy mountains, he is talking about the battle. There's connections here, and we're going to end this discussion tonight. I'm going to give you the three basic standard positions that Bible scholars have taken on exactly how you fit this war of Gog into tribulation, into the war between Jesus and the Antichrist, to the ending war of God and Satan at Armageddon. How does this all fit together? How do these things happen, and how do they collide? Okay, so going to take these things out of here. So now I'm going to, we're going to go down to chapter 39. And again, I emphasize to you, what did you just see? You saw God use his natural creation to supernaturally destroy this huge army. Now, this is beyond our imagination, that God is going to come down and blow away this huge, huge horde of an army. And little old Israel is going to be rescued and saved. It seems impossible, because my natural mind can't really conceive of supernatural phenomenon. I know that they exist, but how they play out and what really happens, my mind can't go there. And so what I do is I refer you back to the disciples, John and Peter, who rushed to the tomb of Jesus because Mary Magdalene had said, he's not there anymore. And when they got there, they found the huge stone rolled away, which is an impossible thing. I don't know how much detail I want to go into, but the Israelites during the time of Jesus buried people in caves called tombs. And whole families could be buried in there because they would let their bones dry out for a year, then they would go back into the tomb and dismember the bones and put them in a little box called an ossuary, and then put this little box in a niche in the wall. And so in that way, you could have generations of a family buried in the same tomb. And so to make sure it was safe, and you could only get back into the tomb by using as sophisticated big equipment that they had in the first century, pulleys and things like that, because in front of the tomb they would make a stone gutter. And then they would get a huge rock and they would round it out so that it just looked like a giant wheel. And the gutter would be slanted so that that's why they called it rolling it away. Jesus rolled away through his own spiritual power. He rolled away his own tombstone. And the tombstones would weigh tons. And you would roll it in front of the cave's opening, and then you would seal it with tar or other kinds of sticky type material so that it wouldn't let even rain seep into it. And so the tomb was very secure. And in fact, the Pharisees were still scared, and they went to Pilate and said, I don't know, they're still going to find a way to rob his body or something. And so Pilate said, hey, take a guard and have them stand all night in front of that tomb to make sure nobody touches it. And a Roman guard was made up of 12 soldiers. I only have 10 fingers, so can't really get 12 out there. But a Roman guard was 12 soldiers. And so this wasn't a small thing that Pilate did. I mean, 12 soldiers, and you're going to tell me that all 12 of them went to sleep, knowing fully that if you fail at a guard duty assignment, you get executed. So this isn't anything like, well, I think I'll take a 2 or 3 hour nap and you can wake me if you want me later on. It's not a casual thing like that. If you fall asleep, you're dead, because that's how important it was, so that if guards did come up against a superior force of people, they just couldn't say that they overwhelmed us. The guards would run away, and the superior force would have its way on whatever it was, a jail cell and a hero inside of it, or money, or whatever it happened to be. They'd go get it, because it doesn't matter what the reason was. If you failed at guard duty, you died the next day. And so for 12 guards to not see anything about Jesus and getting out of that tomb is an incredible experience. And the point of it that I wanted to say is, as you remember in the book of John, John says that he and Peter entered the tomb, saw that it was vacant, and it says that they believed, but they did not understand. And so I think this situation where God supernaturally destroys this huge army from this man, Gog, who somehow represented the Antichrist or was totally committed to the Antichrist, and God takes him down in this supernatural war. Now, in chapter 39, God is still talking against God, and he's saying these things to Ezekiel, and he says, "Son of man," that's Ezekiel, "prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and drag you along, and I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel." Now, there's times when God says the mountains of Israel. There are also times when God says the holy mountains of Israel. I truly am not sure that there's any difference. But if there is a difference, or if it's similar, the mountains that God would be talking about wouldn't be the greatest mountains in Israel that were, by world standards, not all that impressive, but it would be in Israel some of the smallest little humps that would hardly catch your eye, but to God, they were powerful mountains. And that would be the mountain of Zion, in which the temple stood, and which Jesus will return to, which Jesus entered on Easter, on Palm Sunday, when Jesus entered Israel. He came across from the Garden of Gethsemane, across the Hebron Valley, and in through the east gate, and was on the Mount of Zion. And where did he come from? He came from the other holy mountain of Israel, the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives is, I believe, it's something less than 2,000 feet high. That's what I remember. And when you consider, like, Mount Everest is 29,000 miles high, you can see the Mount of Olives is not, from our point of view, an impressive thing. And isn't it interesting how many disciples and how many prophets and how many apostles God had, the judges of the time of Judges, how many of them were just regular people that in the eyes of the world wouldn't seem like a big deal. The Mount of Olives is not a big deal, but to God it is super. It is amazing. A point I'm going to make later on, which I'm going to do now anyway, is after this war, you have the building of the supernatural temple of God that is going to be Jesus Christ's temple during the millennium. And interesting enough, it gets down and tells you a lot of little tiny bitty facts that really are not maybe that you're that interested in. But the interesting point is that Jesus' temple is exactly the size of Solomon's temple. It's not a foot bigger than Solomon's temple. So Jesus' temple is impressive, but it's not like one of a kind. Oh, yes, it is, because Jesus' temple is much more powerful than Solomon's temple, and you know the answer why. Because Jesus is there. And so, you see, in the eyes of God, Jesus' temple is far more powerful than anything on earth. Where Solomon's temple would physically look like it, but it lacks the power. It had the presence of God, but it still is not Jesus' temple. Okay, another fact that is not in modern Bibles, but it was in the King James Bible, And I want to tell you a little bit. Most people have heard. Most people who are Christians certainly have heard of the King James Bible, and the King James Bible this, and the King James Bible that. And if you know your history, King James wasn't all that nice of a guy in the first place. So why is this Bible so important and so incredible? And King James is the one who commissioned scholars to write it. That's why it's called the King James Bible. And the point of the King James Bible, which makes it above and beyond any other Bible up to that point of time, is the fact that the King James Bible is the first time in the history of humanity that the scholars went back to the most ancient writings they could find. You know, and much of, like, for example, the Dead Sea caves, the materials that have been drawn out of there perfectly align with the King James Bible. Letters that John personally wrote or dictated towards the end of his life at Patmos, and then when he came home to die in Ephesus, to the very point, are identical with the Word of God. And the King James Bible took their information from all those ancient things. And so the Bibles up to that time had always been written on the basis of the Bible that came before them. Yeah, we'll take the Bible and we'll make it a little bit shorter and more clear, and change some of the words because our language is changing. And that's what all the Bibles were. They were based on the Bible that came before them, not the King James. The King James Bible went back to as far of the original source as they could possibly go. And this isn't modern times. This is like the 1500s. And so when you say something was in the King James Bible, you have to kind of pick up your ears, because it had a lot of significance to it. And in the King James Bible, chapter 39, verse 2, it actually tells you, and I'm not sure exactly of the words, but what it does is it tells you that only about 1/6 of Gog's army survived all these forces of nature that God threw at them. And you remember, God, those are natural things, yeah, but who created nature? God. And so these things are all of God, just like the supernatural things are all of God. These things are all of God. And so that phrase that comes out of the King James Bible shows you the tremendous impact of this nature that God threw at this army. And I think, what's better than saying, I will defeat you on your terms? Okay, you're not going to use any of your supernatural stuff. No, I'll defeat you on the terms of nature. And that just shows the unlimited power of our God, and the unlimited faithfulness and loyalty God has to us. And I always wish, if I could be 1% as loyal to God as God is to me. And I think every one of us need to stop and think about that. I don't want to think that what I do is of any real importance, because it really isn't. Anyone who was anything in the Bible always knew they weren't comparing themselves to the next door neighbor who never read a Bible in his life. They are comparing themselves with God. God says in the book of Amos, I place before you a plumb line. And basically he's saying, let's see how you do with the plumb line. Because the plumb line is that straight line, that true line that gives you the accuracy of a wall, of a building. And God says, I'm the plumb line. So compare yourself to him. And believe me, it keeps you humble. And that's what, but remember, humility, according to Solomon in Proverbs, says that humility is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of understanding, depending on your Bible. But that humility is the beginning of wisdom. And so let's go on. How much time do I have?
About 8 minutes.
About 8 minutes. Okay, thank you. All right. So I'm going to now take chapter 39, and I'm going to start with verse 3. And it says, then, this is God saying this, then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop to the right hand. On the mountains of Israel you will fall. And all the prophecies in Revelation and in Zechariah about the Antichrist is the Antichrist falls on Mount Zion. He is at the western wall of the Mount Zion when Jesus comes down on the top of the Mount of Olives, which is east. And then Jesus makes this valley. It's called the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Never in the history of mankind has there been a Valley of Jehoshaphat. It doesn't exist. Well, it doesn't exist because Jesus is going to make it at the end of time. And Jesus is going to allow the people, the righteous defenders of Jerusalem, to come and stand behind him with us, his army. And Jesus is going to destroy the Antichrist. Remember, we learned this last week. With what? The power of his breath. Very good. Okay, so let me go on. And it says, and it's very unpleasant, it says, I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and to the wild animals. Carrion bird is a vulture, a bird that feeds on dead things. And so the point, here's an interesting point, is this same story is in Revelation. There are two suppers at the end of time. One is the supper of the, yeah, fine, thank you. One is the supper of Jesus Christ, the wedding banquet, which is a great celebration for us, and wonderful food. And remember, Jesus says, I got hidden manna up here waiting for you. And we have this magnificent feast at the same table as Jesus has. And this is described in detail in Isaiah 25. And so you can mark that down. I won't read it to you because I want to end class and not take the time for that. But it's Isaiah 25. And the other form of a banquet at the end of time is called the supper of the Lord. and that's where all these beasts feed on the dead bodies of Gog and his army. So there's two feasts, one for the destruction of evil and one for the celebration of righteousness. And of course, we could always ask the obvious question, which one of those two do you want to be at? And I think our opinion would be unanimous. So let me just go on a tiny bit farther. When God says this to Ezekiel, and I'm in verse 7 of chapter 39, and he says, this is what God says to Ezekiel: I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I am the Lord. I am the Lord and I am the Holy One of Israel. It is coming, and I will surely make it take place, declares the Lord Almighty. This is the day that I have spoken of. And that's the day of the end of time. And so next week, I want to go into the three theories of what exactly is happening in this war of Gog, and how it fits in with the history of tribulation. So basically, I'm warning you, we don't really know for sure, and so you're not going to get an answer. But you're going to get three belief systems on where this fits in. And interestingly enough, every one of the three have biblical facts to pick it up. So you say, wow, but you know, and I will end with this. When it talks about where Jesus came from, there are three different statements in the Bible about where Jesus comes from. And as I said, they're all different from each other. Well, how can he can't come from three places? So what's wrong with the Bible? Jesus did come from the three places. And I don't know, maybe all three of these theories are right. But we'll see next week. God bless.